Welcome to another episode of the Left Agora. You're about to hear from Andris Shuvaevs, co-chair of Progressivie. That's the Progressives Party in Latvia. Since 2022, he has served as a member of the Latvian parliament. Alongside his political work, Shuvaevs is also an economic anthropologist and researcher. The following is yet another interview that I would like to present on this channel. Within the content, you can find insights about the country in question and Europe, as well as party politics, policy-oriented or election-oriented topics. But the channel also combines this with something else. You can see how a guest personally perceives the world, politics, and life. Regardless of their profession, a politician, a journalist, or an academic, individuals engaged in politics shape our lives and our future. One of this channel's goals is to understand the guests at the individual level. So, in this episode, we explore a political leader's background and motivation to enter politics, the Progressives Party's ideological profile, the economic state of Latvia, as well as Europe, the future of Europe, and even the future of humanity from an anthropological perspective. And now, here is my conversation with Andris Shuvaevs. Before we dive into policy, let me start with a personal and interesting question. Looking back, why did you decide to enter politics? Was your entry into politics more about inspiration, like a person, a book, a philosophy, or irritation such as an incident or a problem that you observed?
Sure. So it happened very gradually. It was never my intention to go into active politics when I was growing up. I'm 34 now, so I'm still obviously relatively young for a politician. But even still, it was when I was in my 20s. So I never thought I will end up in politics. At the same time, it was clear that I was I think from an early age, or not from an early age, from teens, I did have an interest in specifically political questions. I think one part of the answer relates to my studies. I studied at the Glasgow University, and I went to Glasgow in 2010, 2011, and that was at the time when the UK was undergoing its austerity program, and there were the first education cuts. And Glasgow is notoriously a left-wing city, and where there's quite an active student community. And myself, having traveled there from Latvia and seeing the way students organize themselves into certain resistance movements against these planned cuts or transformations within the university, that was my introduction into this kind of activist politics. And I thought it was just very fascinating, and honestly, just an interesting experience for a young person. Later on, when I did my master's degree, and I did that at Oxford, which was quite a change from Glasgow University in terms of the environment as well as the general kind of background to the city. It actually kind of radicalized, I would even say, my politics even more. I became interested in sort of anarchist movements and history and stuff like that, and from an anthropological perspective. So it was always there, this kind of political interest in politics, but mainly from an academic perspective. And then when I moved back to Latvia, and that was nearly 10 years ago, I was actually around the same time when I came back that the party I'm currently co-chairing was forming, and I was aware that it was forming, but I wasn't yet a part of it. As I said at the beginning, the process was quite gradual. I started writing about things, in economics, and putting forward kind of my analysis of what Latvia had been undergoing in the last couple of decades, and at the time, and the people back then who were in charge of the party. I got to know them, so I was orbiting around the party, and then in 2022. That was the parliamentary elections when I had decided to run. It was also the time when Russia invaded Ukraine, so the entire kind of geopolitical landscape shifted very, very suddenly. And people in the party asked me whether I'd be interested to run, and I said, you know, why not? It feels like something I should try. And then I got elected, and from then on, it was, you know, it's been very active politics.
Your experience in the UK was influential, but also when you moved back to Latvia, it was a nice coincidence that the party was being established. I see. That's very interesting, actually.
There was something of a coincidence there, but something of like a fateful coincidence. It is. I'm sure we can discuss that more, but it was also um, it was almost inevitable that a party like Progressive or the Progressives, you know, formed and established itself. You know, in Eastern Europe more generally, but in Latvia as well specifically, you know, left-wing politics was you know, in the last 30 years, 35 years was never a thing. I still regard our party as the kind of first one that's trying to carve out a left-wing space. And then, you know, the economic crisis, the financial crisis of 2009 and 10, that was a, you know, a trauma for a lot of people. But it took some time for people to sort of, you know, organize themselves in a certain kind of political community.
Yeah.
And it was, again, it was a fateful coincidence, I think. Yeah.
And actually, this links me to another question that I'm very curious about. I know labeling a political party can be simplistic or sometimes even misleading, but labels also help us, especially in academia, get a general impression and make comparisons. They are very useful for comparative analysis. So, how would you describe the progressives? Of course, it's a progressive party, as the name suggests, and you already have one MEP with the Greens in the European Parliament, and which is often seen as a strong indicator, though not the only one. How would you compare your party's ideological profile with other political party families in Europe? The Social Democrats, the Greens, the left Greens, or the radical left, including democratic socialists.
Yeah. So this might be a bit of a long of an answer, perhaps, but you know, the short answer is it's a very contested terrain. The way we identify ourselves politically. So the history of the party, you know, back in 2016, 17, when it was being
Mm,
established, it was, and it's called itself, and it's, you know, we still call ourselves a social democratic party. Those There was a, you know, a significant segment of the people that founded the party founded itself based on what they understood as social democratic principles, specifically things like, you know, a progressive tax policy. But at the very
yeah,
same time, there was always a significant chunk of people that were primarily interested in climate politics and green politics. So you always had these two different camps. Camp is not perhaps the correct term for it. It's not that they were opposed in any way, but at least these schools of thought, perhaps within the party, would be more accurate to say. But again, it's not. It would still not be an exhaustive kind of list of schools of thought that are within the party. There was always a notable part that were primarily interested in human rights and again human rights within the Latvian context 10 years ago, and still to this day remained concerned about LGBTQI plus rights, about trans rights, also asylum rights. You know, more generally, I would say currently we are the only party that is ready and that is vocal on the Palestine issue. At the very same time, the fourth kind of segment would, you know, would be concerned with anti-corruption. Latvian politics was, and some might argue still is, tainted by corruption. And then the progressives or progressive, we were the kind of party that prided itself on having a very kind of strict policy when it comes to political donations, and having small donations, transparent donations. There were times when we returned the donations received because we were not sure about the source of the money, or we had questions about the reputation of the person donating money. So there were these kind of four segments that were always, interacting. And it's one thing for the party to be, undergoing this kind of ideological, it's not even mixing with this kind of ideological kind of discovering, rediscovering, or, trying to figure out who people are or what the party is about when it's outside the parliament and especially outside the government. Now, the last 3 years have been, in that sense, transformative for the party, I
Yeah.
think. And especially for myself, when, being the co-chair of the party, basically one of the main responsibilities is trying to define what the exact kind of ideology and marks of identification are. And I think the best experience for me was 2 years ago when we were entering we were forming the new coalition, of which we are still a part. And that was back then, I was a new co-chair to the party. I had been in the position only for 4 months, and relatively new to politics more generally. And then when it came to the question of which ministries would we claim as part of the coalition negotiations, that was my first time when I felt how diverse the party is, and how how and most people are not actually even aware of this diversity, because it was me who was bombarded with calls and text messages about which ministries we should be picking, and it was the entire bunch of ministries that we have in Latvia. There was a feeling that none of these kind of schools of thought actually have dominance. So just to conclude, really, this answer, the way I prefer to call ourselves, I prefer to just say it's left green, with whatever that actually means. It's a fairly abstract, wide encompassing term, but to me that's the most useful one.
Yeah, that's now a very significant point because the diversity of your political party revealed itself, especially during the coalition formation and the cabinet formation process. So that's certainly very important point that you shared with us. So I would like to shift the focus now to policy. Since you entered parliament in 2022, Latvia has taken a number of measures, such as mortgage interest relief, expanded access to small debt relief, and lower taxes for low and middle income earners. In general, how do you assess the overall well-being of society in Latvia today? And also, how would you assess the impact of those reforms in Latvia? And given your experience in parliament and in your party, what should be done next? And perhaps what cannot be done at the moment?
Mhm. So my overall assessment of the socioeconomic situation or condition of Latvian society in general is going to be critical. It is one of the reasons why I entered politics in the first place. The levels of poverty, levels of inequality, they always seem to me as issues that are they're not tolerable, and that require a political intervention and political decision making that is actually aimed towards the reduction of inequality. If we
Yeah.
look at the data now, and I think now is really a good time to have a look at the data in Latvian society, after COVID has, sort of ended, after the inflation that was induced by the Russian war in Ukraine has sort of passed, and now we are in this kind of seemingly new political reality, also with the new U.S. administration. If you look at what's happened in Latvian society in the last three to 5 years, then generally, for most of the population, the situation has, it's pretty much as it was. If we look at the 60% of the society, for them, the economic conditions, will have probably stagnated for the last 5 years. In some other regards, they have even deteriorated, and I think that's kind of the harsh reality of things. Obviously, we would always have to look at this in relative terms. If you look
Yeah.
globally, then obviously the EU countries will be generally better off. But again, obviously, when you're here on a domestic local level, you always look at things relatively, and you see that the situation has not improved in the last 3 to 5 years. You want to ask?
Yeah, and in response to the perceived geopolitical risks, namely Russia, Latvia is now spending around 3.5% of its GDP on defense. How long can Latvia and actually other European countries uh, sustain this higher level of military spending, in your opinion? And what will be the results in the short term or even in the long run? Political, economic, and social impact of such a high amount of military spending I'm asking about.
Mhm. Sure. Latvia is going to spend 5%, or at least there's a political decision that's going to increase that spending even more. And that's going to be the same in Estonia and Lithuania as well. The question of how to sustain it, because obviously that is politically not an easy thing to do, especially if you're in a low growth environment, which is the case at least for Latvia. Then there are certain costs that you have to start considering. One is increasing the public debt, which is the situation here in Latvia. Again, for us politically or even economically, that's not a problem. Myself, I believe that's completely justified for now. Or you go for a tax increase, which is what they did in Estonia. And this is, if we look at their experience, and I'm sure you can find some people to talk to there as well. I don't think they're very happy about that decision. I think they will lower taxes next year, because I think the social tension is definitely increased. Now, if we look at the case of Latvia or Lithuania, Estonia, we can, it's sustainable for 3 to 4 or 5 years. If we look at it in a much more long term, and we should be looking at it in a much bigger long term than we are now, then I don't think it's very sustainable. I think the only way how to really tackle that problem is only on a European level. And I think the current European institutions are not really equipped for this kind of job. If we look at the kind of a strategic objective for European armament or rearmament programs, then you have 20 plus units essentially, most of them making investments in defense. But I would venture to guess that does not happen in a very coordinated fashion. Obviously, you have some, common programs like SAFE, for example, right now, and that's going to introduce some coordination, some common procurement. But to me, that's still a kind of a half measure. I think it's very difficult to sustain that kind of defense spending unless Europeans, and this is the point I will be arguing in hopefully many platforms, do start considering a fiscal union, which has obviously been a topical, a controversial and a controversial topic and not a politically easy topic. But I think that's something that Europeans should be considering. But at the same time, I'm sure even if that does not happen, the Baltic states will definitely keep investing in defense, no matter the kind of the political developments in that specific regard. Now, again, the case of Latvia does show that politically across the entire political spectrum, there is a near unanimity on this issue. And again, if we look at as a society more generally, there's societal support for these kinds of measures as well. So it's not the case that there might be, notable segments of the population that might be dissatisfied with that kind of thing. So again, politically, it's actually quite easy in that sense to make that decision. What is more difficult is making decisions regarding other areas, because in the case of France and its increasing public deficit, obviously people are paying attention to that here because there is a perception that we might be in very similar circumstances in the future. Me personally, I don't really see that right now. But again, as a political frame in which issues are debated, that is prevalent here, and is going to be in the future as well. But you mentioned some of the policy initiatives that have been passed in the last couple of years. And
Yeah,
the one thing that we are quite proud of our time in the government, and that is the tax policy and the changes we introduced. I do think
yeah,
it's mainly just because of us that we were able to pass that kind of tax policy and really design it in such a way. And I'm pretty sure that the kind of fruits of the reform are going to be seen in the next couple of years. We already are starting to see that now. Like Latvian growth levels have been again near 0 or 1% for a long time now, and that's what makes increased investments in the long term unsustainable. I'm pretty sure the tax reform is going to change that, and we will see much better results. And again, increased political freedom when it comes to decision making about resources as well.
yeah. I already asked this question before in the previous episodes, and in the following episodes of this channel, I think I will ask it again and again because I'm really curious about the predictions, the imaginations of guests on my channel about the near future. How do you imagine Europe in 2045? Let's say if progressive politics succeeds. And if progressive politics fails, of course, I can also reformulate my question. What does Europe look like 2 decades from now?
It's a more, it's the kind of almost age-old question now of, whether Europe should be moving towards more integration or not. Our party's policy has always been more integration. I think it's quite reasonable for a small country like ours, that feels the threat of Russia on a daily basis and understands its kind of geopolitical power, or sometimes the lack of it and the potential impact it can make. It was clear that our future is within a much wider geopolitical unit, which is the European Union, as well as NATO, which is an important structure, sort of running side by side to the EU. Again, if I look at the 2045, and if I look at it strictly from the prism or the perspective of defense policy, which I really think we should be focusing more, and I think that's you're interested in left-wing politics. I'm sure you've come across with it as well. The left-wing politics, it's kind of openness, or it's kind of academic potential with engaging with the issue of war, I think has always been an easy. If you look at sort of Western left-wing, political parties and movements, war or the prospect of it has most of the time been framed in terms of their own domestic political elites engaging in war activities, under the guise of one issue or another, being very critical of U.S. Foreign policy, etc. And I think for these left-wing movements and for left-wing thought more generally, it's very difficult to engage with a reality that somebody might actually be attacking you, and threatening your existence, your national existence, in a way that it's been unprovoked from your side. I think that's the kind of conceptual political issue for many left-wing movements, and it's not the case here at all. We are, for in that sense, I think we are a party that is, it's a left-wing party, as far as left-wing as you can be in Latvia. That is as pro-NATO as possible, and that's not a very common kind of combination, I think, for people in sort of Western Europe. And I think if I look at Europe and the EU in 2045, from a kind of left-wing perspective, then that's where we should be getting now. I think that's where the kind of thinking has to be going, is that the left-wing movement has to engage with the issue of war and defense policy. And it's not an easy thing to do for very obvious reasons. One is, there are investments going in that area, and the question is, and it's a question that will be used politically by more centrist and right-wing forces, which is a certain political choice you have to start making between investments in defense and social issues. If left-wing movements succumb to this kind of dilemma, I think that's a terrible scenario for us. And that's why I'm mentioning that, the only way how you can really avoid this kind of trap is by redesigning European institutions. One is a fiscal union. The other is you have to really, really reconsider the institutional positioning of the European Central Bank. Its independence has to be questioned, is my deep conviction. Of course, not in a way that currently, the independence of the Fed is being questioned by, attacking certain governors. I think that might not be the most useful way of going about it. But I think, again, politically, you have to. If you have the ECB in its current form, to me, it's clear that the defense objectives will not be met, and left-wing movements will be framed within these false dilemmas, which are very difficult to escape. So that would be my vision for 2045, and in a couple of minutes, is basically this: engage proactively with war and defenses as hard political realities, and do not try to escape from that or try to argue that peace is a possibility. It's likely that it's not, and it's not for lack of wanting it. It's because the other side, in this case Russia, is simply determined to go in the complete opposite direction. Because if they do start considering peace as a political option, then that very likely means the end of the current political elite in Russia, and that's obviously something that they will not consider. But for that, you really need to engage with the macroeconomics. You really need to engage with the European institutions as they currently are, and you need to start, drawing up visions in which they change. If they don't change, then it's going to be tough.
As a Latvian political party, you emphasize the importance and emergency of defense. But I'm curious, are you in a sort of dialogue with other left-wing political parties in Europe, especially those who do not prioritize defense, or who criticize those which prioritize defense? Do you have healthy communication with other parties, especially with parties not in Eastern Europe, but the rest, basically, the countries which do not perceive um, urgent defense spending, or urgent attention to defense issues?
Sure. So, the one arena where that does happen is the European political family that you mentioned already, the Greens.
Yeah.
That's the mission of our MEP there is to really foster that dialogue within the political family, and do a lot of explanatory work with parties that are more in the south. So that would be in Spain and Portugal, Italy, etc. Again, it's completely reasonable from their perspective not to have that issue as their top three priority. And it's a lot of political work to create that argument structure, and to create that narrative that it is about them too, that it is within their national interest to be engaging with that issue, because it's for them, this kind of war is a distant reality. So we do have those conversations, but again, they happen in that very specific, I guess, Brussels European, green framework. It's And me personally less so. Myself being and most of us here in Riga being so focused on the work we do nationally, that those kind of lines of communication are, yeah, there's very little time for that. But at the very same time, there are some opportunities. In 2 days' time, I will be going to Stockholm, where we have a Greens Nordic Baltic summit. And there too, we will engage this issue of defense and Russia, and how to tackle those things. Probably not and that's the kind of format where there's less explanatory work that needs to be done, since we're more or less on the same page, and we can start thinking more strategically about how to do it. And again, I'm not. I don't think there's a lot of discussion happening outside this kind of green political family circle. when it comes to other parties on the left, where there's a lot more kind of skepticism about engaging with these issues, because their kind of historical tradition is the one that I mentioned. It's been very focused. It's, stemming from this kind of peace movement and anti-nuclear movement. Those are elements that are still institutionally established in their parties. So I imagine that the dialogue is more difficult there.
You are both a politician and an anthropologist, so that's why actually I'm very curious about your answer. I would like your take on a more existential question about our world.
Okay.
Today, our technologies are far more advanced than 5 decades ago, yet people still harm each other. Individuals turn to violence in daily life, states resort to violence, poverty and uncertainty about the future persist, and undemocratic ideas are gaining ground. We are even afraid of our own creations, such as AI, not to mention nuclear weapons, of course. And since ancient times, philosophers have reflected on this, but today we face it at existential levels, right? So, given all that, what do you see as humanity's biggest problem, and how do we face it? What is wrong with us?
Again, as an anthropologist, as having that kind of academic background to myself, my experience has been that uh, one of the main learning points or kind of main takeaways that I had from anthropology was that, and that's very much kind of David Graeber inspired. He was a famous anthropologist, and that was kind of very influential in my kind of academic and political thinking as well. His writing was about, he has a famous book called Possibilities, and one of the first paragraphs, or in the foreword, he writes that one of the reasons why he became interested in anthropology was that it was telling these stories of these many different ways in which people have lived over many thousands of years. And his essays were always trying to explore these different human possibilities that are available to us. And I think that kind of encapsulates my sort of interest in anthropology in the first place. But I think it has sort of translated into politics as well. Is that, on the one hand, sure, there are clearly many terrible things happening in the world today, and all around us, and obviously active war zones, but equally in places just in our neighborhood as well. You mentioned violence, and I regard politics as a very violent space. It's not the kind of space where things are given to you just because you want them. You really need to fight for your ideas and policies and values on a daily basis, and that is often a violent exercise. And I think that might be a reflection more generally of just a violent kind of social economic structure in which we live, which is where that violence is fundamentally sort of embedded. But again, at the same time, that kind of Graeber's thinking about possibilities has been always, to me, quite optimistic, since one of the sort of interesting things and gifts of anthropology was learning just about the many different ways people live, and therefore, it's I guess I'm kind of fundamentally driven by the same kind of feeling that the way we live now is something that's just happening now, and we have all the agency we need to mold the world in a way that we would like it to be. But it's never. But it itself is not going to be a happy, joyful kind of process. It is going to be a struggle, literally often a struggle. And then it's just a question of having the right kind of mindset, having the right kind of people around you, having that kind of team, having that kind of support network around you. And if you have that, then you can do a lot of great things, I'm sure. Um, and equally with developments in technology, I think anthropology also informs this kind of thinking better, in the sense that there's they are our own kind of creations, sure, but at the very same time, it's important not to impute too much kind of external agency in those things, they do remain our creations. And in that sense, they can still be created and recreated in ways that we would like it to be. I guess that's generally kind of left-wing politics is kind of thing driven by this kind of sense of optimism, regardless of the many things happening around us that make us often regret that we are part of it in the first place.
But this is also my position, actually. I mean, we of course identify the problems, and we know that it's a struggle, as you said. But at the end of the tunnel, I think there is always hope, and as long as we fight for it, that there are many reasons to be optimistic in this world. That's also what I'm thinking. But it was a very, very inspirational interview. It was a very nice conversation for me. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andris Shulaevs, for being with us today.
Thank you, Akif. It was a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to listening all your other episodes as well in the future.
Thank you for watching this interview with Andris Shulaevs. I truly enjoyed our conversation, which was yet another source of inspiration from the world of politics for thinking about a better future. For more dialogues like this one, join me here at the Left Agora by following the channel. Until next time, let the Agora echo with new voices.